Okay, so I'm just going to do some basic keyframing here. I've created a cube, and in my layout for Cinema4D, I've just changed the layout to animate, which means we get a timeline along the bottom, which is really handy for when we're doing keyframe animation. So we're just going to set some basic keyframes and look at how we change the timing of them. I've set a keyframe for this one. I've selected it and hit F9 on my keyboard, which is the shortcut for a position, rotation, scale keyframe. I'm just going to go forward to frame 25, so that's 1 second. I'm going to grab my move tool, and I'm just going to slide my box across so it moves a distance, and I'm going to hit F9 again, and that sets a keyframe. So as soon as we've got more than one keyframe, Cinema4D will show us the path of that object on the screen, and you'll see that there's little black dots on that path. Those represent the position that the cube is going to be in on each frame. We will also see down in our timeline here that we've got keyframes set. These are these sort of box shapes that we get in the timeline, and this is for our cube object. And if we open up the cube object, we can see that because we hit F9, it set position, scale, and rotation keyframes. I haven't changed the scale of the rotation, but that's what that shortcut does, is it just sets position, scale, rotation keyframes. So that is our basic keyframing. We've set keyframes, we can see them in the timeline. When we're looking at just the keyframes in our timeline, this is the dope sheet. Okay, so the dope sheet shows us the time of our keyframes. Now in the dope sheet, it's really easy to select keyframes and change them in time, just shift them around. So the dope sheet is what we use for timing our animation. If I just rewind and hit play, my cube is moving. Now Cinema4D by default puts a little bit of easing in our keyframes. So what we're seeing with this animation here is that there's a little bit of acceleration and there's a little bit of deceleration at the end. Now I can tell there's a little bit of deceleration at the end of my motion, because if I look at this path with the little dots on it, towards the end of the path, these dots get closer together. This shows me that for each frame, the box is moving a little bit less. So Cinema4D is automatically putting a little bit of easing into that animation. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to create a couple of different versions of this box, and I'm going to illustrate how we change the easing and what that looks like. So select your cube, hit Command-C, Command-V to duplicate it. So we've got two cubes. Now I want to move the second cube. I want to shift all of its animation just to above my original cube so that I can do a little bit of comparing and contrasting. If I try and move the second cube that I've made, it's got keyframe animation, so if I try and move it, the keyframe animation overrides my movements. I want to collect this cube and all its animation and shift it upwards. The easiest way to do that is to create a null, put my cube in it, and then just move that null upwards. So I've just taken that entire cube and all its animation and parented it onto a null to shift it around. So now I should have two cubes with exactly the same animation, just one sitting above the other. And this is a really important concept in 3D as well. When you've got an object that's animated, quite often you want to take all that animation and shift it somewhere else, or you want to stick that object to something else but keep its animation. So this whole process of parenting becomes really important with animation. Okay, now I've got two cubes. I want to play around with my easing a little bit to see how I can control my slow in and slow out on my keyframes. So on the second cube that I've made, and here it is in my timeline, I'm going to go to the position keyframes. I'm going to open that up, and at the moment I've just set my animation going along the x-axis. I can see it here in my perspective view. So I'm going to open up the x position, and here's the actual function curve, or the F curve, for this animation. So this is showing over time how my object is moving. Now I can make this this function curve display a little bit larger. If I carefully bring my mouse just to the bottom of that section in the timeline, I can click and drag and just expand this area so I can see the curve a little easier. I can also use Option in my right mouse button to zoom in a little bit, and Option in my middle mouse button just to pan around in my timeline. So I want to be able to see this easily. Whoops, just make that a bit bigger. There we go. Okay, so this F curve, this function curve, this shows the easing of our animation. And as you can see, Cinema4D automatically puts some easing in. This isn't just a straight line, it's got a little bit of a curve to it. And if I select either one of these keyframes, I can see this little Bezier handle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this initial keyframes handle to the right. And what that's doing is making a very shallow curve that then starts to rise. And I'm going to do the same with the other keyframe. I'm going to select this end keyframe and pull its handle to the left. And I'm just going to really accentuate, if I can click and drag this properly, accentuate that easing. So I've got almost a flat curve, then it accelerates, then a slow curve. So let's have a look at that. If I hit play on my timeline now, so what we can see here now is we've got two cubes. Their keyframe animation is exactly the same. They both start their animation at frame 0, they both end their animation at 25, but you can see the type of animation is completely different. The top cube accelerates very slowly and then suddenly accelerates and moves quickly in the middle of its animation, and then it slows right down again. So we're controlling that with this function curve in the timeline. So what that also shows us that on our function curve, when the function curve is quite flat, we don't have much movement or don't have much change in animation movement. As the curve gets steep, that means we've got a lot of change going on. And then we've got it flat at the end again, so we've got much less change in animation. Okay, so I've got a little bit of easing and a lot of easing. Okay, I want to do one more version of this, so I'm going to copy and paste my null with my cube in it. So I'm going to have 3 of these. And this new null that I've made, I'm just going to lift that up in the air as well. So this is going to be default easing. This is exaggerated easing. And this one I'm going to have linear, which is no easing. Oops, linear, better spell that right. Okay, so if we want to do cartoony style animation, this exaggerated easing in the middle is probably pretty good. It's a good thing to kind of aim for, because a lot of cartoony style animation, not all of it, but a lot of it is quite over-exaggerated. If we wanted to do really mechanical, robotic type animation, we wouldn't want much organic easing. We'd want quite linear type of motion. So I'm going to select my top cube here, and this is where you can see it's really important to name your objects, because it's very quickly you get a lot of objects and channels to animate in your timeline. So for my linear object, I'm going to select all the keyframes here, and I've got a couple of little wee default animation styles that I can set in my tools across the top of the timeline. There's one here which is 2 lines coming to a point, and that is linear animation, so there's no curve in my timeline anymore, sorry, in my F curve for this cube. So I've just selected its keyframes, I'm in its X position keyframes, and I've just set its animation to linear. So if I hit play again, now we can see we've got this top cube has no easing. It's just going at a constant speed from start to finish. Doesn't accelerate, doesn't decelerate, just starts and stops. Now that's definitely a lot more kind of robotic, it's not organic. If you do want to make mechanical motion, linear is a good place to start, but even with machines there is usually some sort of acceleration at the start. So we usually have a little bit of easing at the start and end of animation. But it's certainly very easy just to select keyframes and apply linear animation if we just want direct stuff to be happening. So that's an example just showing 3 objects, exactly the same keyframes. Keyframe timing in the dope sheet is all exactly the same. But the in-between, the function curves, the easing, gives three very different styles of animation. So that's really important to understand, that your function curves, your easing, your in-between stuff, that really controls the style of your animation.